Well, good morning. We're up to John chapter 13, and just to pick up from where we left off last week, I want to give you this overview here. We did this thing on the Upper Room Discourse some weeks ago. Actually, I don't know when it was, Dennis. It was a couple of years ago or something like that. And I did John 13 to 17, so we're kind of revisiting that, but coming at it from another angle, another dimension. And as I said last week, I was just summarizing John chapters 1 to 12, and that we could call the book of signs because you have an array of messages and ministry, miracles. And so the messages, remember the 7 I am statements and the 7 miracles, all were signs that pointed beyond himself to the fact that God is in his midst, in his presence. In fact, he is God with us. And so he is the very living presence, the way, the truth, and the life, who is the very source of all these things manifested in our lives. But now in John 13, we move to the book of glory, where we're moving from a public to a private ministry. And at the end of the day, he waits until the end, this last time, that we get to listen in. Only John gives us this opportunity to hear his last words to his disciples. If you could gather all your friends and loved ones that you wanted to hear what you had to say on your deathbed, and you were able to do that, what would you tell them? And if you think about that, it's a good question to process, isn't it? Writing your eulogy now to see what that would look like now. We talk about that in Recalibrate Your Life. There's a little exercise for doing that. But the interesting thing is, what would you tell them? Here we get to hear what the living God has to tell us, and how we get to hear like a fly on the wall. Am I quoting Shakespeare? You don't know, because it's amazing how much of our language was, in fact, dramatically affected by his work, as we said. But the fact is that we get to listen in, and we get to hear these great words. And they are so profound and so other-centered, because in this upper room discourse in John chapter 13 to 17, he focuses on 3 main things: love, joy, and peace. And if you just looked at those 5 chapters through the lens of love, through the lens of joy, and peace, it's other-centered. He knows he's going to be on the cross in less than 24 hours, and yet it's still ministering to these people to the very end. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And so we have that preparation of the disciples. And so we're now going to be looking at, I've got an outline. Warren Wiersbe's clever. He comes up with these clever outlines. And so sometimes they're forced, but this one's pretty good. One of them, I think, is. But humility, Jesus and the Father. And so I want to look at the image of who Jesus is in this text here, in those first five verses. And Jesus knew 3 things. He knew that his hour had come. Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus knowing that his hour had come. And by the way, the feast of the Passover, that allusion, because we're dealing with that last week. And so on Monday, he entered Jerusalem that Sunday. And that Monday, then he cleansed the temple. On Tuesday, it was a day of conflict with the religious leaders. And then Wednesday was silent. But Thursday is the upper room. So just to get you a perspective on what's happening in this context here. But he knew 3 things. He knew his hour had come. He knew he was going to be betrayed. And he knew about his identity. And so the first part then, knowing his hour had come that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. It's just this wonderful image that you see here. So if you consider this, my hour has come. Remember that divine timetable we've seen before. And if you just study how many times it alludes to the fact that his hour has not yet come. And yet now he can say that, Father, the hour has come. He knows now that all these things are in God's time. It's in God's hand. And that's a good way to live. Every day, we really have to live according to God's timetable rather than our own, and it's a wise way to see. But he recognized that, and he understood who he was in this context. So it's talking about his relationship with the Father as well. Let's take a look at that. So he would say that he would depart out of this world During the supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. And so here we have then the idea that he knew even from the beginning who it was who would betray him. He knew this, he recognized this, that he knew from the beginning that he was going to be doing so. Yet he still washed his feet. That's the amazing thought. Now consider this, the grace of Christ, that even at the very end, it's not too late. It's a bona fide offer. Now it's not too late. And yet, woe to that man. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed, as the scriptures have predicted. But woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. But he was still given that gracious opportunity. It's a deep and profound mystery that the love of Christ, that he would wash the feet of the one who would actually betray him, is an amazing thought. So all these things, Jesus is on God's divine timetable. And I will tell you this, that when the servant of God is in the will of God, he's immortal until that work is done. So many of us are living on borrowed time to accomplish unfinished business. I know I'm one of them. And I think most of us are. And not just because of your age, but because you don't even know how many times actually your life almost was lost. Even this morning, somebody might have been looking at one of these things and almost hit you. Who can say? You do not know. Your life is held on the thinnest of gossamer threads. And it can be gone in a moment. That's why the prudent man lives as if this is his last day on earth. And if it's not, thank God for a new day tomorrow, and you have another mini life to live. And so it's a way of living in the presence of God. But he also knew something else. During the supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him. This third verse, is the most significant one, because this is the one that really illustrates why he was able to take on the order of the towel, to wash the feet of the disciples, to put the needs of others be first, because he knew who he was, where he came from, and where he was going. So Jesus, knowing these three things, he knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. Secondly, that he'd come forth from God. And third, he was going back to God. I want to unpack that a little bit with you. Because of that, he was able to get up from supper, and he laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. You see, this was an embarrassing situation in the upper room, because apparently there was no servant who was normally going to be there to wash the feet. And I'll explain about this business of washing the feet and why that was a part of the custom for that to be done. And so none of them were going to be washing anyone's feet there when they saw the servant wasn't there. Why? Because they were all fighting for their place in the sun. They were arguing about who's going to be the greatest, you see. So not one of them would do that. So then Jesus does this thing, and so he gives them a visual parable. I have a little presentation that I did in the past on relational spirituality. I sometimes use, and I just want to pull out a little theme from that. So you know the major theme here of being, loving God completely, knowing, loving self correctly, and doing, loving others compassionately. And if you want to summarize my whole teaching, it comes down to these three major themes of letting God define us. And so loving God completely, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, with all, and inside out. And if you love him, then you're allowing him to define you. May I know you, Augustine said, may I know myself. And if you cannot know yourself until you know your God. The better you know him, the better your capacity is to grasp who and whose you are. And that means loving self correctly. And you remember how I've defined that before. It means to choose to believe that what God says about you, for example, you are my child, that you are holy and beloved, that you are chosen and called by me. You've been adopted into my family. All those things. You have to choose to believe that those truths are so, in spite of your feelings and experiences to the opposite, because the contrary. Because how many of us have heard lies, raised with false scripts? You'll never amount to anything. How come you can't be like your brother? You're just stupid, aren't you? And any number of things. And I often find that many men's greatest achievements have been done to prove to even a father who may be dead that they're going to amount to something. It's a sad thing, because they're driven men. And they have to prove something. And actually, when the world defines you, you don't have security. You don't have significance. You don't have satisfaction. The world will never, it's always saying, what have you done for me lately? Only the Word can give you the security and significance and satisfaction that God has wired you to want. But you must find it in the right place. Because if you look for it in the world or people or possessions, it will not work. And so loving self correctly is to actually believe that what God says about you is true. And that gives you this, that when to the degree to which you acknowledge that, you are now capable of loving others compassionately. Why? Because you're secure enough to serve. You have to be secure to serve. No, everyone wants to be called a servant, but no one wants to be treated like one. You may have noticed that. They're overlooked. They're taken for granted. So here, you must serve, even if there's no reciprocity. It doesn't destroy you because you know who and whose you are. And that, in turn, leads back to God, because you see, whatever begins with the love of God, ends with the love of neighbor, then enhances my relationship with God. So it's a reciprocal relationship that goes on and on. And so in relationships, he is the divine peace restorer, because in this fallen world, there's brokenness between a God and ourselves and others. We know that. And he is the comprehensive relationship restorer who pursues us and woos us. And so the loving the Lord your God with all your heart, the great commandment, and loving your neighbor as yourself emerges from that. So you can see the vertical should express itself on the horizontal. And that's exactly what's going on here. And so how do you express God's love on the horizontal? No act that begins with the love of God that doesn't end with the love of neighbor. A new commandment I give to you, even, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. So we'll see that later in this chapter, this extraordinary command. It's a new command. In the past, you were to love one another as you love yourself. This is a higher command. To love yourself as Christ loved you is greater than even that you love yourself. So it's a new thing that wasn't done. It's impossible of attainment, can only be done as you walk in the Spirit and abide in Christ. And so you express that. So the more that you have that relationship, the more you can express it in the horizontal. If you don't have love, you don't know God, for God is love, and therefore we need to understand who and whose we are. That's the problem. The quest for greatness, people will constantly try to fight for it. And they were saying, for example, grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory. You see, they were fighting for their place in the sun. And the other disciples, the other 10, were resentful that they wanted that because they wanted the same thing. So it's the realism of the Gospels, that they basically reveal their own folly, is astonishing. But the essence of true greatness, even the Son of Man, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So what I call is this: I am among you as one who serves. I've given you an example, and I'm showing you what it looks like. So that it's a visual parable, you see. He doesn't even have to use words when he did that. It was a shock to the disciples. They didn't know what to make of this. And so he was Lord yet servant. He knew his dignity and power, you see, that he had come forth from God, that that all things were given into his hand, and he was going back to God. He knew those three things. And that's what made it possible for him to serve. And I'm claiming that those are true of us as well, because he knew who and whose he was. Because if he were bound by or defined by the opinions of people, consider his life, how he was criticized, rejected, slandered, misunderstood, plotted against, betrayed, denied, and ultimately abused. And frankly, this continues to grow as the disciples continue, the Gospels continue. It gets worse and worse. If he were defined by that, he would not have been secure enough to serve. But he was defined by the resources that his Father had given him. Here's the beauty. Just as all things have been given into our hands, we've also received every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. Just as he knew where he had come from, he had come forth from God, guess what? You have come forth from God, because now you've been adopted into his family. You've come forth from God. Third, just as he knew where he was going, so we know where we're going. We're going back to God. And so we know our security. Nothing can separate us from that love. And that's a profound point, because we're secure enough to love and serve others without reciprocity or manipulation. Don't have to be enslaved by the opinions of others. Nothing to prove. No need to manipulate and impress. That's a holy relief. Love without strings. So I just, my little excursus onto that material here, because I wanted to give you that. And so I now go to Jesus and Peter. I only have a few more minutes. But I really wanted to zoom in on that text of Scripture because it's so absolutely critical for us to see. And so he washes their feet, wipes them with a towel. Simon Peter says, "You wash my feet? What I do you do not realize now, but you'll understand later. Never shall you wash my feet. If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Then Peter goes one extreme to goes the opposite extreme. "Oh, give me the whole deal." And so he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And so there are a couple of words that are being used here, and one word that's being used is nipto for wash in most of the text. But luo means to be bathed in 13:10. And so there's a distinction between the two, and it's intriguing to see what that looks like. Our union with Christ is settled, but our communion with Christ depends on our keeping ourselves unstained by the world. So what happened was this, that he completely, you are washed. You are, now that you are in right relationship with me, you don't need the whole cleansing as you did the first time. That's been taken care of. But now it's a matter of dealing with it as we go in our relationship with others. So our union with Christ, but our communion. It's like the Old Testament priest, when he was consecrated, he was bathed all over. But that was only one time. After that, it was not repeated. So what we have here is the concept that you are now in relationship with me, but you need to deal with washing your feet from the dirt of the road and so forth. And therefore, that's what was being done. In the same way, washing your feet, keeping that, you're already clean in relationship with God, but you have to deal with the daily issue of anything that sets you apart. Anything that separates you from the love of God would seem to do that. So this is the point here that ultimately we see that we have right relationship with him, but we still need to do on a daily basis, notice and ask the Spirit to show if there's any area of unconfessed sin, acknowledge these to the Lord and thank him for his forgiveness and move on. So that's what we mean by the foot washing, if that makes sense. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined, "You know what I've done to you. You call me teacher and Lord," and he writes, "So I am. If I then, the Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I gave you an example that you should do as I did to you." So he says, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. And it makes me think about something we've taught before about this whole idea of leadership, because the leadership has these three words that actually in the scriptures begin with an S. It's not my alliteration. We're called to be stewards. That's your perspective. You don't own anything. You're stewarding the resources of another. But you're called to be a shepherd as well, and that's your position. That you're to guide the sheep. You're to feed them. You're to protect them. The third component is to be a servant. That's your practice. And all of us are called to be leaders in love. We're all called to be practitioners of leadership. And that means that you have to embrace the mindset of a servant and be willing to be treated as such as well. Because you're not on your own business, you're in the King's business. So it's a perspective and the people in your life and God's, but at the end of the day, whatever it comes down to that practice. And so when he says in this theme here, going back to this material, so when he'd washed their feet, he says, "You call me teacher, I've given you an example." And so he speaks about the happiness that Jesus provides. And this may be, going back to this other text here, we have holiness with Peter and now happiness. That's maybe a bit of a force, but it's really referring to joy, because remember, technically speaking, joy is not the same as happiness. Happiness is circumstantial. Joy transcends circumstances. So, but sometimes you have to force it. But Jesus and his disciples, verses 12 to 17. So when we look at this, he speaks about this whole concept of what I've done for you. I don't speak to you all, but now I'm telling you before it comes to pass, you'll believe that I am. And he who receives whomever I send receives me, and who receives me receives him who sent me. And so we see this whole idea of dignifying sacrifice and service. And so there's a blessing in verse 17. If you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. And this is, it's not just from knowledge or emotion, but from application. Then in verses 18 and following, we see Jesus and Judas. So going back to our material here, much of it has to do with that concluding part of the material. So we go back to that for a moment. So in 18, so we have, I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I've chosen. But he who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. I'm telling you before it passes, and when it happens, you'll believe that I am he. He who receives whomever I send receives me. He who receives me receives him who sent me. So he predicts his betrayal, that one of you will betray me. And so Judas was very clever. Somehow they never figured it out until it was afterwards. Even then, when he left, they thought he was going to he had the money purse, that he was going to give some alms and so forth. He was really very deceitful and clever, and they didn't know who it was. So Simon Peter gestured at him, tell us who it is whom he is speaking. And he leans back on Jesus' bosom. Lord, who is it? This is John referring to, sitting at his right hand. It's the one for whom I shall dip the morsel. And so he's after the morsel. Satan entered into him. Jesus said, what you do, do quickly. None of them knew what was going on. They thought he was buying some things for the feast. He went out immediately, and it was night. And that's a chilling word, and it was night. We know it was night. But it's to say the motif of light and darkness is being underscored, you see. And John emphasizes the darkness, the image of light and darkness. He's the light of the world, and those who do evil hate the light. So when he left, the atmosphere was cleared. When he'd gone out, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. And this glorification, what is he referring to? It really refers to his death and his burial and his resurrection. It includes the entirety. And so he recognizes that before honor comes humility, and that the cross precedes the crown. And it's so with us as well. If we seek to receive honor in this world, we're making a terrible blunder. The wise person will seek the honor of the one who sent him, and will seek to pursue him and be pleasing to him, and leave the outcome in God's good hands. You see, you cannot really know what that's going to look like. But to seek honor among men, or recognition or prestige among men, is a snare and a trap. And many a religious leader has done so, and to their own hurt, harm, and detriment. But rather to recognize that we don't even know, and you won't know, the vast bulk of your true impact in this world, because it was meant to be hidden, because if you got feedback directly all the time, you'd live for it. And so at the end of the day, most of it's hidden, although every so often you'll get something, a word, a note, or encouragement, a phone call, that will say, you may not know this, but what you said or what you did. And that comes at a time sometimes when you need a little of encouragement, you see. So God says, child, you're going in the right direction. But you have to walk by faith and trust me that it's going to be more than worthwhile. At the end, what you're really seeking is the well done. Not the honor of men, but the honor that the Father will bestow as one who is pleasing to the Father. And that is a proper desire. So that's why Paul says, my great ambition is to be pleasing. I make it my ambition to be pleasing to him, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to him. So he instituted the Eucharist and began to instruct his disciples in this text. And so, little children, I'm with you a little while longer. You'll seek me, and I said to the Jews, where I'm going, you cannot come. And this was a hard word for them to hear that. And it's going to lead to great trouble. In fact, the next chapter is going to be dealing with their anxiety and their fear and their horror about what this means, because he's going to say, do not let your heart be troubled. So why is it troubled? Because of what he's just said at the end of John 13, when he when he said that where I'm going, you cannot come. But then before it goes into that, he goes into this new commandment, this higher calling. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And that's been called the mark of the disciple, the love that you have for one another. And if you have this unity and diversity and an organic and love for one another, where people can see it, a witness to the world, where there's something about that. But sadly, the Christian community often appears as one that's constantly fighting and bickering and accusing and so forth, and even virtue signaling when another falls, which is a tragic thought. And not like as in Galatians 6, but rather where if you see someone, you want to humble yourself and actually realize you could have done the same thing. You pray for the person, and then you look to God, realizing that's a word for you, because you could have done the very same thing. But instead, there's a disunity, discord. Remember, I've told you this image before, this idea of in the essentials, remember what it is? In the essentials, unity. In the non-essentials, liberty. And in all things, charity. A lot of people get all bent out of shape over secondary things. We want to have unity in the essentials, but we can give love and charity on the non-essentials. We don't have to agree on everything if they're not essential doctrines. And so this whole idea of unity and diversity, having a love that you will love as I've loved you. Well, that's impossible of human attainment. That's why we can say the spiritual life is not difficult. It is impossible. And it only becomes possible when you realize you can't do it. But he can do it in you and through you. How? As you. That's the beauty of this. It's a unique application. So Peter says, where I go, he tells them, where are you going? You cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later. And it'll be more than you bargained for at the end of the day. But all of us, ultimately, are called to be honoring him and to glorify him. Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. But I think about this idea of and it makes me think of something that Peter wrote himself later on, after he goes through this whole process. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, when he talks about this concept, as a chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. And he says, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon him, because he cares for you. I love that verse. You want to cast your anxiety upon him, because you know he cares for you. And so this is how Peter, when he was restored then, had a purpose. And Jesus said, you're going to be betraying me, but ultimately you will be my own. But it's going to be a process you have to go through in order to do this. So we have all these motifs that are in this text of Scripture. And so putting this together, we could zoom in on any one of these components together, but just to let you just kind of discuss anything that you wrote down or noted and what implications that has. But here's a pretty powerful thing, that visual parable, and what it means to wash the feet of another man, what that looks like. The other option besides that is to consider using this image here. And that might be another way of doing it, because it's kind of the same thing. What is my perspective on what I've been granted? Who are the people God's entrusted me with? And how is he calling me to serve just as he served us? Maybe that's the one we'll do, because it gives specificity to our discussion. So let's do that, and we'll pick it up afterwards. One thing I thought I'd underscore before we go further is we talked about this whole idea of 2 things I just want to comment about very quickly. Number 1, that Christ's resources are our resources. Recognize then that just as he every spiritual blessing, you've come forth from God, you're going back to God. And I find that orientation to be very critical, and it reminded me of something I've taught you before. It had to do with meaning, identity, purpose, and hope. You might recall this, but this I keep returning to on a regular basis. The question of meaning, the issue of meaning relates to the question, where did you come from? And if you came forth from God, if you were coming forth, if ultimate reality is a personal agent who is a lover of your souls, and not only is majestic and magisterial in terms of the author of the creation, but also the lover of your souls, it gives you a meaning that otherwise you wouldn't have. If you don't have that ultimate nexus of where you came from, then life is just a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing. You see, to quote Macbeth, since we're doing Shakespeare. But then you also have identity. What you have is that Hamlet, rather. Identity. Who am I? And as you know, the world will define you by default. The word will only define you by discipline. So you have to allow God to define you, to ask yourself, who am I? Jesus had to wrestle with that. And because only then do you have the security to serve. The third question that we have to ask is, why am I here? These are pretty basic questions, wouldn't you agree? Where did I come from? Who am I? Why am I here? Very few people ask them consciously, and most people would be embarrassed to have to even think about them, because they can go for decades without really wrestling with these fundamental questions. It's amazing to me. Why am I here? What is my purpose? And only the scriptures can give you, in a relationship with Christ, a biblical vision. And then finally, where am I going? What is my hope? Where am I heading? So these four questions, in my view, can only be answered from a biblical perspective. Reason and empiricism, those two pathways to knowledge, are not sufficient to answer those questions. You need a third way of knowing, namely revelation. And only revelation can provide the answers to those questions. But here's what's interesting. They will erode and dissipate. Left to itself, you'll forget these things and live as if the world is your home. So we were talking about leadership, and let's see what thoughts you had. You have any? Right over there.
Was thinking, and that last slide you brought the verse that keeps coming back to me is, when we see him, we'll be like him.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And it seems like that leads to a fifth question: who will I be?
Who will I be? Yeah.
It's not who am I now, but who will I be for eternity?
Yeah.
I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
No, that makes me think about your very question here in 1 John, especially in chapter 2, near the end. Now, little children, what does he say for us to do? Abide. Remember, trust the Father, abide in the Son, walk by the Spirit. Abide in him, draw your vitality from him. So that when he appears, and that could be at any time, we may have come, you don't know when it'll be, but when you live in such a way that if he were to appear tonight, you would not shrink away from him in shame at his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone who practices righteousness is born of him. And then he goes right into this idea, see how great a love the Father has bestowed on us, that we should be called children of God. And such we are. And here's the interesting point. For this reason, the world does not know us, because it did not know him. Now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, what? We will be like him. That relates to your thought, because we will see him just as he is. So have this hope, and if you have that hope, it'll purify you and cause you to recognize that perfect person that he's called us to become like, and who is now giving us his power to do so, which is very similar to Colossians 3. So you have died and your life is hidden with Christ. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then what? Then you will be revealed with him in glory. So the world has not yet seen what we'll be, but we're living in that way. So these are fundamental questions. Yeah. What other thoughts did you have? And this other thing here. This has become increasingly meaningful to me. Just as we've been given every spiritual blessing, we've come forth from God, we're going back to God. So all that relates to these questions. I have to return to them regularly, or I'll forget. Chuck.
Well, Jay made a comment that his dad was saying there's a book that's never been written. It's like how to be significant when you're no longer significant. And how do you search for significance when you're no longer significant? You know, and we had quite a discussion around this table about that mindset.
What was your answer to that question?
We didn't really have an.
How do we define significance? You see, and that's the issue. Is significance, is it in terms of the accomplishments we've done, or because the identity with which we've been bestowed an identity? So your significance really has to do with this very question of significance and identity. You've become children of God. He knew where he'd come from. So it's tough to, the ultimate name dropping. Someone says that they know the king, or they know some prince or someone like that, or some well-known public figure. That's nice. But the real thing is to know the living God. That's the ultimate name dropping. I mean, how much more significant than to say that I'm part of the Father's family, that I've come forth from him and I'm going back to him. So we have to decide, how do we define significance? Because the problem is the world will define it usually in terms of plaudits and accomplishments. And those are not the metrics that we're counting. So we know it's going to require you to walk by faith and not by sight. Because faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So true significance is not found in pursuing what's now and what's visible, but what's to come and is not yet visible. But the world has not seen what you will be like, but you know who you are, and you know where you're going, and you know where you came from, and because of that. So I find that I have to constantly reinforce that biblical perspective of significance, or I will default to the world's statement that what have you done for me lately? Or what's your impact? Or how do you quantify that? And if you do that, you're not secure anymore, and therefore you sure won't be able to serve. You see, you're going to be using people to try to get your own name recognized. It's a difficult thing, but I find it. So I want to be brutally honest about the fact that every day we have to choose to walk by faith or by sight, and every day I die daily. You have to put Christ back at the center on a daily basis. I think there's a question over there. Yeah.
It seems to me as though in God's sight, nothing can be defined as service if there is an expectation of recognition.
That's a good way to put it. In God's sight, nothing can be defined as service if there's an expectation of recognition. That's why, again, people may like to be called a servant, but they don't want to be treated as one. Because to be treated as one is to be taken for granted, to be invisible, to be not noticed. But therefore, we have to decide, who is noticing? Am I playing to the visible audience of many or the invisible audience of one? That requires faith. And so the biblical vision then requires the renewal of the mind. Therefore, as I say often, we leak. And so we constantly unlearn those spiritual truths. You have to constantly renew it, and reestablish it, or you will lose your place in this world, and you'll forget that you're a pilgrim, a sojourner, an alien. You're not home. And yet you're waiting not for the plaudits of men, but for the pleasure of the Father who says, well done. And that requires a walk by faith. But you have to review and renew on a regular basis. There's a question over here, and we're actually out of time, but just one more. You got your hand up just in time.
I heard you mention earlier about being servant treated.
Yes.
There's a scripture that comes to mind that says, blessed is the man that's not offended in me.
Mm.
And I noticed that in order to really esteem being servant treated, I would have to see those things as opportunities. When I'm lied on or persecuted or treated lowly or not acknowledged, if I didn't learn to esteem those as opportunities,
Yes.
I would always be offended at the very thing that's giving me access to Christ.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And so those are opportunities, divine given appointments and opportunities. And we know who we are, even though the world does not. And it will not be revealed in this world, who we really are. It'll be revealed when Christ returned, or when we see him, and then we will be like him because we will see him just as he is. So that requires a day-by-day realization that our identity is not based upon the seen but the unseen, not upon the now but the not yet.